Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Housing's definitely become a political headache for the government, but it's a nightmare for most New Zealanders who all around the country are saying, why don't we have a government that actually does something? Why doesn't the government that was elected in 2011, why doesn't it actually roll up its sleeves and build some affordable houses? Why doesn't it actually protect the interests of New Zealand citizens? People are wondering why, sir, that's happening. We have, after 4.5 years of inaction by this national government, we have some of the most unaffordable housing in the world. Generation X and Y are locked out of home ownership. The most vulnerable people in this country are about to be booted off State House tenancies by this government as a deliberate matter of policy. And in Christchurch, sir, by the government's own reckoning, up to 7,500 people are officially homeless because this government has taken a hands-off, do-nothing approach to the post-quake housing crisis in Christchurch. What's National's response to the housing crisis? What's their response? They've set a target of 39,000 consents in Auckland, sir, and they've set up a mechanism to fast-track new greenfields land in Auckland. And every single credible submitter that came to the Select Committee on the Housing Accords bill said to the Select Committee that this bill would not result in any more affordable housing being built. What a failure. What an absolute loss of credibility, Mr. Chairman. The National's response, such that it is based on the trickle-down theory of housing. They think if they simply encourage the building of more housing, no matter what price those houses are, that somehow that will make housing more affordable. Well, sir, it's a pipe dream. We don't buy it. All of the opposition parties don't buy it. The government's approach to housing, its philosophy to this housing crisis, is basically blame councils and trust the market. Well, I think people see through that. People can see that that is simply not a credible response to a crisis that New Zealanders are desperately wanting some bold and decisive action on. It just doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be the case that we have the most unaffordable housing in the world. It doesn't have to be the case that in Christchurch people are facing another winter of whole families sleeping in uninsulated sleep-outs or paying hundreds of dollars a week to rent a caravan in someone's backyard. It doesn't have to be that way. We have choices. We have a choice between a do-nothing government that wants to trust a failed housing market, or we have an alternative government that will actually roll up its sleeves and build affordable houses. A government that will change the economic settings that got us into this crazy housing mess that we're in now. And the National Government refuses to contemplate adjusting the very economic settings that they've presided over for the last 4.5 years. They refuse to tax speculators through a capital gains tax in a way that would take much of the speculative heat out of the housing market. Well, sir, we have an alternative. With our Kiwi Build policy, we will build 100,000 affordable starter homes over 10 years, sir. And with fine New Zealand building companies like Fletcher's, like Stonewood Homes, and I could rattle off half a dozen others, we will build homes that people will be proud to live in for generations to come, not, as Bill English said yesterday in the House, slandering the work of some of our construction companies, describing their houses as being like the back end of Moscow. Labor in government will tax the speculators. A capital gains tax that excludes the family home will go a long way to channeling investment into more productive economic development and away from overheating the housing market. We will restrict offshore speculators and stop them driving up the prices of New Zealand homes and outbidding New Zealand first home buyers at auction. We will put a stop to it because unlike this national government that stands on the side of speculators, we stand for ordinary Kiwi home buyers and especially first home buyers. We are determined to do something about the declining rates of home ownership in this country, sir, because we believe that home ownership is a good thing. We will adopt policies and we will change the economic settings that will make a difference and get Kiwi first home buyers into their first homes. Singapore, Hong Kong, UK, Switzerland have all recently adopted policies that restrict the activities of offshore speculators. Mr Chairman, and Australia has had the very same policy in place since 1987. It is a good policy and it puts the interests of New Zealanders first. Sir, the government has got themselves into a terrible mess with the housing crisis, and the controversy around loan-to-value ratio limits on home mortgage lending is a perfect illustration of this, sir. John Key negotiated only a few months ago a memorandum of understanding with the Reserve Bank that gave the Reserve Bank the power to implement these limits on home mortgage lending. He gave the Reserve Bank those powers, and now he stands there and cries crocodile tears for first home buyers, pretending to be surprised that the Reserve Bank actually want to do something about the overheating of the Auckland housing market. That is a risk to the macroeconomy, and that is because this government has refused to do anything about the forces that are overheating the Auckland housing market. The Reserve Bank quite correctly says that it is a threat to financial stability. They don't want homeowners to lose their shirts when the housing bubble bursts. So, of course, they're going to use these loan-to-value ratio limits. Now, if the government was actually willing to do something serious about the housing crisis, then these so-called LVR, loan-to-value ratio limits, would not have such a huge impact on first home buyers. And that's why Sir Labour's calling for a temporary exemption for first home buyers while a capital gains tax kicks in and while Kiwi Build delivers the affordable homes that will ease the supply crisis. Sir, National have mismanaged and run down Housing New Zealand. They have. Their restructuring of Housing New Zealand has been a fiasco. They've closed 24 offices. They've sacked 121 full-time workers. They changed the eligibility criteria so at the stroke of a pen, thousands and thousands of the poorest New Zealanders suddenly became ineligible for a state house. And in places like Gisborne on the east coast and in Napier, there are dozens and dozens of perfectly good Housing New Zealand houses lying vacant while people who would have been eligible for a state house have been forced into the private rental market, into overcrowded and substandard accommodation, sir. That is a disaster. Housing New Zealand, under this government's watch, has botched the redevelopment in Maraenui, in Pomare and Glen Innes North. They have been running Housing New Zealand into the ground. And today, sir, at Select Committee, the internationally acclaimed team of researchers from Otago University's Health and Housing Research Program came along, sir, and told the Select Committee that the government's plan to impose reviewable tenancies on all 69,000 Housing New Zealand tenants will create a public health risk. And they have the data to prove it, unlike this government, who has no evidence base for their policy of imposing reviewable tenancies on Housing New Zealand tenants. The Otago University academics made the point. Dr. Michael Baker made an excellent submission saying and showing the data, sir, that Housing New Zealand tenants are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. They have very high health needs. State housing and social housing has a demonstrated positive impact on those people. It reduces hospitalisation rates. The children of families who live in Housing New Zealand houses are healthier and safer and better off than kids in families that are not in Housing New Zealand houses, sir. Their research clearly shows that. By creating insecurity for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, National are creating a public health risk, sir. It will lead to increased hospitalisation. It will undoubtedly cause unnecessary deaths. This thoughtless, negligent policy by National, forcing reviewable tenancies on Housing New Zealand tenants, will create social harm and social damage, sir. They're forcing people out of state houses into the private rental market in the middle of the worst housing shortage in a generation. Otago University academics came along to the Select Committee today and they said, sir, that they could not see any evidence base for the government's social housing reform bill. And actually those very academics came along and presented an evidence base for the opposite of the government's policy of making Housing New Zealand tenants even more vulnerable and more insecure. I think that, sir, was a huge wake-up call and an indictment of this government's housing policy.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to rise to contribute on this